A 9-week-old bobcat kitten named Rusty and a 20-month-old chimpanzee, Maxwell, share a very special friendship at Palmetto Wildlife Sanctuary in South Carolina. They found each other at the sanctuary one day, and the rest is history. The two spend most of their days playing, chasing each other, cuddling, and even napping side by side. Totally inseparable. Maxwell is very protective of his wildcat pal, and Rusty doesn't mind being cuddled by Maxwell. They spend most of their days chasing and playing with each other. Both were orphans. Both were alone. Both carried wounds deeper than anyone could see. This is the extraordinary true story of courage, survival, and a friendship that rewrote the rules of the natural world. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning mist hung heavy over the South Carolina lowlands as wildlife rehabilitator Margaret Sullivan pulled her truck into the emergency entrance of Palmetto Wildlife Sanctuary. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from the pre-dawn cold, but from what she'd witnessed on Highway 17 just 30 minutes earlier. In the carrier secured in her truck bed lay a tiny bobcat kitten, barely 9 weeks old, orphaned by a vehicle strike that had claimed its mother's life. Margaret had worked in wildlife rehabilitation for 23 years, but the sight of the mother bobcat's body beside the road, with this lone survivor mewing pitifully nearby, had shaken her more than usual. Perhaps it was because bobcat mothers were so devoted, rarely leaving their young unattended. This kitten had likely waited beside its mother's body for hours, maybe even a full day before Margaret's headlights had caught the tragic scene. Dr. Thomas Whitfield, the sanctuary's veterinary director, met her at the intake facility. His weathered face, marked by decades of both heartbreak and triumph in wildlife medicine, softened when he saw the tiny bundle of spotted fur. "Another orphan?" he asked quietly, though the answer was obvious. "Male kitten, approximately 9 weeks," Margaret reported, slipping into professional mode as a defense against the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Found him beside his deceased mother on Highway 17, mile marker 42. No visible injuries, but he's dehydrated and hasn't eaten in at least 24 hours, possibly longer." As Dr. Whitfield began his examination, the kitten let out a weak growl, an attempt at the fierce snarl that would one day make him a formidable predator, but which now sounded more like a squeaky door hinge. Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling slightly. "Still got fight in you," she murmured. "That's good. You're going to need it." The examination revealed what they'd expected. The kitten was malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from exposure, but otherwise physically healthy. The real concern, both professionals knew, lay in the psychological trauma. Bobcat kittens typically stayed with their mothers for up to 10 months, learning crucial hunting skills and social behaviors. This one had been robbed of that essential education far too early. "We'll need to minimize human contact," Dr. Whitfield said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But at this age, without any other bobcats in rehabilitation..." He didn't need to finish. They both understood the dilemma. The kitten needed care that only humans could provide, but too much human interaction could doom any chance of eventual release back into the wild. It was a balance they struggled with constantly in their work. The sanctuary sprawled across 200 acres of carefully maintained habitats, designed to house and rehabilitate native wildlife, while maintaining as natural an environment as possible. As Margaret carried the kitten to the specialized carnivore nursery facility, she passed several enclosures, each holding its own story of rescue and, hopefully, eventual release. But the nursery held an unexpected occupant that morning. Barbara Morrison, the sanctuary's primate specialist, stood beside an enclosure typically reserved for infant raccoons or opossums. Inside, a young chimpanzee sat quietly, his large brown eyes following her every movement. "Barbara?" Margaret called out, confused. "What's a chimp doing here? This is supposed to be native species only." Barbara's expression was grim. "Emergency situation. This is Maxwell, about 20 months old, confiscated from a roadside zoo that got shut down yesterday. The conditions were..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Horrific. He's the only survivor from a group of 4. Margaret's heart sank. While her expertise lay primarily with native species, she knew enough about primates to understand the gravity of the situation. Chimpanzees were highly social creatures. A young chimp who'd lost his entire social group would be suffering from grief as profound as any human child would experience. "What's the plan?" Margaret asked. "We're just temporary," Barbara explained. "There's a proper primate sanctuary in Florida that can take him, but they need 2 weeks to prepare a suitable introduction group for him. Until then, we're keeping him stable, fed, and as comfortable as possible." As if understanding he was being discussed, Maxwell moved closer to the fence, his fingers wrapping around the chain link. There was something in his eyes, a loneliness so deep it seemed to echo through the morning air. Margaret looked down at the carrier containing the Bobcat kitten, then back at the solitary chimp. An idea began forming in her mind, one that went against every protocol she'd been taught, but which tugged at her with unusual insistence. "Dr. Whitfield is never going to approve this," she muttered to herself. "Approve what?" Barbara asked. But Margaret was already walking toward Dr. Whitfield's office, her mind racing with possibilities and potential arguments. The heated discussion that followed would become legendary in the sanctuary's history. Dr. Whitfield's initial response was exactly what Margaret had expected. Absolutely not. Mixing species was dangerous. A bobcat, even a kitten, was a predator. A chimpanzee, even a young one, possessed strength that could easily harm the smaller animal. The risk of disease transmission, the different dietary needs, the completely different eventual life paths, the list of objections seemed endless. But Margaret had done her homework during the walk to his office, and she came prepared with counter-arguments. "Both are highly intelligent social species," she argued. "Both have suffered severe trauma and loss. The bobcat needs to learn behaviors that would normally come from its mother: play hunting, boundaries, social interaction. The chimp desperately needs companionship to prevent psychological shutdown." "You're talking about an experiment that could go wrong in a dozen different ways," Dr. Whitfield countered. "Or it could go right," Margaret insisted. "Look, we have 2 weeks. 2 weeks where Maxwell needs companionship and the bobcat, let's call him Rusty for his coloring, needs more than we can give him in isolation. We monitor them constantly. The slightest sign of aggression or stress, we separate them." Barbara, who had followed them to the office, unexpectedly supported the idea. "There's actually precedent for this," she said quietly. "Not exactly the same, but close. The Cincinnati Zoo successfully housed a cheetah cub with a puppy. The San Diego Safari Park has documented numerous interspecies friendships that developed under similar circumstances." Dr. Whitfield rubbed his temples, a gesture his staff recognized as a precursor to reluctant agreement. "The board is going to have my head if this goes badly." "The board doesn't need to know unless it goes well," Margaret suggested with a slight smile. And so began one of the most unusual experiments in the sanctuary's history. The introduction was painstaking in its caution. First, the 2 young animals were housed in adjacent enclosures, separated by a mesh barrier that allowed them to see and smell each other without direct contact. Rusty, despite his weakened condition, initially displayed the typical bobcat response to a larger animal. He arched his tiny back, his spotted fur standing on end, and produced what he clearly believed was a terrifying hiss. Maxwell's response surprised everyone. Instead of showing excitement or aggression, he simply sat down near the barrier and began gently grooming himself, occasionally glancing at the kitten with what could only be described as polite interest. It was as if he understood that this small, frightened creature needed space and time. For 3 days, they maintained this arrangement. Rusty gradually stopped hissing, though he remained wary. Maxwell began spending most of his time near the barrier, sometimes offering pieces of his fruit through the mesh, which Rusty ignored with feline disdain, being a carnivore. But the gesture seemed to communicate peaceful intentions. The breakthrough came on the 4th day. Margaret arrived for the morning feeding to find both animals sleeping against the barrier, separated by mere mesh but clearly seeking each other's warmth and presence. Rusty was curled into a tight ball, his usual defensive posture relaxed. Maxwell had one long arm stretched along the barrier, his fingers just barely touching the mesh near where Rusty slept. "Well, I'll be damned," Dr. Whitfield said when Margaret showed him the security footage. "They're self-soothing through proximity." The decision to allow supervised direct contact was not taken lightly. Barbara and Margaret spent hours discussing protocols, preparing for various scenarios, and establishing strict guidelines. They would start with brief 5-minute sessions with both handlers present, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. The first meeting was scheduled for a quiet afternoon. Margaret carried Rusty into a neutral enclosure, one that neither animal had claimed as territory. Barbara brought Maxwell in from the opposite entrance. They set both animals down about 10 feet apart and stepped back, though remained within immediate reach. What happened next defied every expectation. Maxwell, displaying remarkable gentleness for a creature capable of significant strength, slowly knuckled forward a few feet, then stopped. He sat down and extended one hand, palm up, toward Rusty, a gesture startlingly similar to how a human might offer their hand for a dog to sniff. Rusty, his natural feline curiosity overcoming his caution, crept forward. His movements were classic predator, low to the ground, ready to bolt, every muscle tense. He reached Maxwell's hand and sniffed cautiously. Then, in a moment that made both handlers hold their breath, he rubbed his tiny head against Maxwell's fingers. The young chimp's face transformed with what could only be described as joy. Very slowly, with infinite care, he brought his other hand around and gently stroked the kitten's back. Rusty not only tolerated this, but began purring, a rusty, unpracticed sound that gave credence to the name Margaret had chosen for him. "I've never seen anything like it," Barbara whispered. "It's like Maxwell understands exactly how fragile Rusty is." Over the following days, the relationship between the unlikely pair deepened in ways that continued to astonish their caretakers. Maxwell adopted a protective, almost maternal role with Rusty. He would carefully groom the kitten, picking off bits of dried formula or debris with the delicate precision that chimps usually reserved for their own offspring. When Rusty played, practicing the pouncing and stalking behaviors crucial to his species, Maxwell would participate by dragging leaves or feathers for the kitten to chase, seeming to understand intuitively that Rusty needed to develop these hunting skills. Perhaps most remarkably, Maxwell began modifying his own behavior to accommodate his smaller friend. Chimpanzees were naturally boisterous, given to sudden movements and loud vocalizations. But around Rusty, Maxwell moved with deliberate calm, keeping his voice to soft hoots and gentle grunts that wouldn't startle the sound-sensitive feline. Rusty, for his part, seemed to view Maxwell as a combination of parent, playmate, and living jungle gym. He would climb onto Maxwell's back, riding along as the chimp knuckled around their shared enclosure. When tired, he would curl up in the crook of Maxwell's arm, purring contentedly while the chimp gently groomed his spotted fur. The arrangement that was supposed to last 2 weeks stretched to 3, then 4. The primate sanctuary in Florida, informed of the situation, agreed to delay Maxwell's transfer, intrigued by the behavioral developments Margaret and Barbara were documenting. Dr. Whitfield, initially the biggest skeptic, became one of the arrangement's strongest advocates after witnessing a particularly telling incident. A large hawk had flown over the outdoor portion of their enclosure, its shadow passing overhead. Rusty, responding to ancient instinct, had immediately frozen in terror. Young bobcats were vulnerable to large raptors. Without hesitation, Maxwell had scooped up his friend and carried him to the safety of their indoor shelter, holding him close until the perceived danger had passed. "That's learned protective behavior," Dr. Whitfield had said, his voice filled with wonder. "He's not just tolerating Rusty, he's actively guarding him." But as the weeks passed, a difficult reality began to assert itself. Rusty was growing rapidly, his kitten fuzz giving way to the sleeker coat of a juvenile bobcat. His play was becoming rougher, his claws sharper, his need to hunt more pronounced. Maxwell, too, was developing, his strength increasing daily. What had been safe when Rusty was a tiny kitten was becoming potentially dangerous for both animals. Moreover, there was the fundamental issue of their futures. Rusty, if he was to have any chance at life in the wild, needed to begin distancing himself from non-bobcat companionship. He needed to learn to hunt live prey, to be wary of larger animals, to develop the solitary nature that would keep him alive in the forests of South Carolina. Maxwell's future lay with his own species, in a sanctuary where he could form proper chimpanzee relationships, learn the complex social hierarchies of his kind, and live as naturally as possible for a chimp who could never return to the wild. The sanctuary staff held meeting after meeting, debating how and when to separate the pair. Every option seemed cruel. The animals had formed a genuine bond. Separating them would cause distress to both. Yet keeping them together would ultimately harm their development and potentially their safety. It was Margaret who proposed what seemed like an impossible solution, one that would require exceptional cooperation from the Florida Primate Sanctuary and a significant modification of the sanctuary's own protocols. "What if we don't completely separate them?" she suggested during one particularly emotional staff meeting. "What if we transition them gradually, maintaining some form of contact even as they move toward their different futures?" The plan that emerged was unprecedented in its complexity and ambition. Over the course of 6 weeks, Rusty and Maxwell would be gradually transitioned to spending time with appropriate role models of their own species. Rusty with an adult female bobcat who had recently arrived at the sanctuary for rehabilitation, and Maxwell with a mature female chimp on loan from the Florida sanctuary, who would eventually accompany him to his permanent home. But, and this was the revolutionary part, they would also maintain scheduled playtimes together, carefully supervised and gradually decreased in frequency. The goal was to allow them to naturally grow apart while maintaining the psychological benefits of their friendship. The transition was not without its heartbreaking moments. The first night they spent in separate enclosures, both animals called for each other. Maxwell with increasingly distressed hoots, Rusty with plaintive mews that echoed through the sanctuary. Staff members, hardened by years of wildlife work, found themselves wiping away tears. But gradually, remarkably, the plan began to work. Rusty, introduced to the adult female bobcat named Sage, began learning the proper behaviors of his species. He learned to hunt, starting with already deceased prey, to mark territory, to make the various vocalizations that bobcats use to communicate across their solitary territories. Yet during his playtimes with Maxwell, he retained the gentle social side that their friendship had nurtured. Maxwell similarly began forming appropriate chimp bonds with the female, learning to groom properly, to observe chimpanzee social etiquette, to communicate in the complex ways of his species. But he never lost the gentle protectiveness he'd developed with Rusty. The day of Maxwell's departure to Florida was anticipated with deep ambivalence by the entire sanctuary staff. They had arranged for one final extended playdate between the unlikely friends. As the two animals rolled and wrestled in the grass, groomed each other, and finally settled down for a nap in the sun, Rusty curled against Maxwell's chest as he had as a tiny kitten. There wasn't a dry eye among the observers. "You know," Dr. Whitfield said quietly to Margaret, "in all my years in wildlife rehabilitation, I've never seen anything prove the capacity for interspecies empathy quite like this." When the time came for Maxwell to leave, something extraordinary happened. As Barbara began to lead Maxwell toward the transport carrier, he stopped and turned back to Rusty. The bobcat, now a sturdy juvenile with the beginnings of his adult markings, sat watching his friend. Maxwell knuckled back a few steps, gently touched his fingers to Rusty's head, and made a soft, specific vocalization, one the staff had never heard before. Rusty responded with a deep purr and rubbed against Maxwell's hand one last time. "It's like they're saying goodbye," Barbara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Like they understand." Maxwell's departure left a noticeable void at the sanctuary, but Rusty continued to thrive. Under Sage's tutelage and the careful guidance of his human caretakers, he developed into a capable young bobcat. 6 months later, he was successfully released into a protected wilderness area in the Francis Marion National Forest, where trail cameras would occasionally capture images of him. Healthy, hunting successfully, living the wildlife he was meant to lead. Maxwell, according to regular updates from the Florida sanctuary, integrated beautifully with his new chimpanzee troop. He became known for his gentle nature, particularly with younger chimps, and his unusual tolerance for other species at the sanctuary. The staff there reported that he would often sit at the edge of his enclosure that bordered a habitat for rescued servals, watching them with what seemed like fond recognition. Margaret kept a photograph on her office wall. Rusty and Maxwell curled together, sleeping peacefully. Two orphans who had found solace in the most unlikely friendship. Whenever she faced difficult decisions about unconventional rehabilitation approaches, she would look at that photo and remember that sometimes the heart knew truths that protocols couldn't anticipate. Years later, when Margaret was training a new generation of wildlife rehabilitators, she would tell them about the bobcat and the chimpanzee. She would explain how their friendship had challenged every assumption, broken every rule, and ultimately taught the sanctuary staff that compassion and connection could transcend species boundaries in ways that science was only beginning to understand. Wildlife rehabilitation, she would tell them, isn't just about following procedures and maintaining proper boundaries. Sometimes, it's about recognizing when two broken hearts can help mend each other, even if those hearts beat in very different chests. Rusty and Maxwell taught us that recovery isn't always a solitary journey. Sometimes, healing comes from the most unexpected companionships. The story of their friendship became legend in wildlife rehabilitation circles, cited in papers about interspecies bonding and the psychological benefits of companion animals in rehabilitation settings. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, it remained something more. A testament to the resilience of young spirits and the universal need for connection that transcends the boundaries humans so carefully construct between species. In the wild forests of South Carolina, a bobcat hunts alone, as his kind have done for millennia. But perhaps, on quiet nights when the moon is full, he remembers the warmth of an ape's gentle embrace and knows that solitude doesn't mean loneliness when you've once been truly loved. And in a Florida sanctuary, a chimpanzee sits with his troop, grooming and playing as chimps do. But sometimes, when a small bird lands nearby or a butterfly passes close, he reaches out with extraordinary gentleness, as if remembering a small, spotted friend who taught him that strength's greatest expression is tenderness. Their paths diverged, as they had to, but the impact of their friendship continued to ripple outward. In the protocols revised at sanctuaries across the country, in the academic papers written about their bond, and most importantly, in the lives they went on to lead, forever changed by the weeks when a bobcat and a chimpanzee proved that love knows no boundaries.